Hi everyone, welcome to a story that begins in silence but rises in power. Before we go any further, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications because stories like this remind us why queens never bow for long. Welcome to Black Queen Dominion, where truth always rises and dignity always wins. This story began long before rejection ever showed its face. It began in a small, sunlit neighborhood where a black woman learned early that her skin carried history, strength and beauty, whether the world acknowledged it or not. She grew up surrounded by resilience, raised by a mother who taught her that darkness was not something to apologize for, but something to protect. Her confidence was not loud, it was rooted. Her ambition was not aggressive, it was steady. She built herself quietly, piece by piece, without waiting for permission. When love entered her life, it felt natural, unforced, and sincere. She believed love would see her fully, not in fragments shaped by prejudice. Marriage followed with hope in her heart and trust in her future. She stepped into a new family believing respect would follow commitment. He was wrong. From the very beginning, there was a chill that no smile could warm. Her presence unsettled something ancient and ugly in her mother-in-law's worldview. The woman who raised her husband carried generations of internalized colorism, carefully disguised as tradition and standards. The darker the skin, the harsher the judgment. And no matter how accomplished, graceful, or intelligent the new bride was, her skin remained the first and final verdict. The comments never came directly. They hovered in the air, wrapped in implication and silence. Invitations became conditional. Compliments arrived poisoned with comparison. Approval was dangled like a reward she was expected to earn by shrinking herself. The family gatherings became quiet tests of endurance, where she learned to sit straight, speak less, and absorb more than anyone ever deserved. So she tried. Not because she lacked pride, but because she believed patience could soften hearts. She believed that consistency would eventually dismantle ignorance. She believed love was worth the effort. And so she endured the whispers, the side glances, the way her worth seemed questioned simply by her existence. Her husband, raised in the same environment, did not fully see the harm. He loved her, but love without understanding can still wound. He encouraged peace, urged silence, and called it compromise. Each time she swallowed an insult for harmony, a piece of her spirit hardened, not in bitterness but in clarity. The breaking point did not come loudly. It arrived one quiet afternoon, carried by a truth she could no longer ignore. She realized that no matter how kind she remained, how successful she became, or how loyal she proved herself, she would never be enough for someone committed to misunderstanding her. And with that realization came grief, but also freedom. She began to withdraw emotionally, redirecting her energy inward. Instead of chasing approval, she invested in herself. She returned to her passions, expanded her work, and strengthened her independence. Her silence was no longer submission, it was strategy. While others underestimated her, she built quietly, deliberately, and powerfully. What no one in that family noticed was how deeply capable she was. They saw her only through the narrow lens of bias, never asking about her achievements, her connections, or her intellect. They mistook her calm for weakness, her humility for insignificance. And that misjudgment would soon cost them everything. Because while they focused on skin tone, she focused on infrastructure. While they clung to outdated hierarchies, she moved through modern systems with ease. Her life extended far beyond the family home into boardrooms, networks, and decisions that shaped outcomes. But with preparation. The storm had not yet arrived, but the sky was already shifting. Somewhere ahead, a crisis was forming, one that would shake the family's foundation and force them to confront the very woman they had dismissed. And when that moment came, they would learn that darkness does not mean deficiency. It means depth. The shift began subtly, almost invisibly, the way all real transformations do. While the family continued life as usual, clinging to comfort and routine, the woman they overlooked stepped into a new phase of her becoming. The weight of judgment had not crushed her, it had refined her. Every moment of exclusion had sharpened her awareness, teaching her who she could rely on and who she could not. Her marriage entered a quiet distance. Not from lack of love but from imbalance. She had grown, while her husband remained tethered to familiarity. She no longer needed validation from a space that drained her. Instead, she cultivated self-respect, learning that peace was not found in tolerance of disrespect, but in firm boundaries. Beyond the walls of her home, her professional life flourished. She expanded her ventures, strengthened her reputation, and became a problem solver others depended on. She was the woman people called when systems failed, when decisions mattered, when reputations were on the line. Her name carried weight in circles her in-laws never imagined she belonged to. Meanwhile, cracks began to form in the family's carefully maintained image. Financial missteps, outdated investments, and poor leadership decisions quietly piled up. The same pride that fueled discrimination now blinded them to reality. They dismissed warnings, ignored advisors, and trusted tradition over strategy. The family business, once a symbol of status, started to bleed resources. Still, they did not look to her. Even as the situation worsened, the idea that she could be a solution never crossed their minds. Colorism has a way of limiting imagination. It convinces people that power looks only one way. As the pressure mounted, fear replaced arrogance. Losses became impossible to hide. Legal threats emerged. Partnerships dissolved. What was once whispered became undeniable. The family faced collapse, and for the first time, survival outweighed pride. It was then that someone mentioned her, not as an equal but as a last resort. Her expertise, long ignored, suddenly became relevant. The woman whose skin had been deemed unworthy was now the only one capable of untangling the mess they had created. Desperation softened the sharpest tongues. The mother-in-law, who had spent years upholding silent cruelty, now stood at the edge of ruin. The truth was unavoidable. The future of everything she valued rested in the hands of the woman she had tried to diminish. Denial had completely lost its power. What remained was exposure. Every hidden bias, every quiet insult, every moment of dismissal now stood illuminated by reality. The family's survival was no longer theoretical. It was actively unfolding through the hands of the woman they once reduced to nothing more than her skin tone. Her presence changed the atmosphere of every room she entered. Not because she demanded attention, but because competence has a gravity of its own. Decisions that once took weeks of argument were now resolved with clarity. Chaos that once felt permanent began to organize itself. She didn't raise her voice, didn't seek validation, didn't announce her authority. She simply exercised it. For the first time, the family watched her closely. And what they saw unsettled them. They saw discipline where they had assumed insecurity. They saw intelligence where they had assumed limitation. They saw leadership where they had only ever seen a woman they thought should be grateful to belong. The mother-in-law observed all of this in silence. Each success felt like a mirror reflecting her own failures, not in business but in character. She had spent years policing skin tone while ignoring substance. Now substance was the only thing standing between her and complete ruin. Shame is a slow emotion. It doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in quietly, replacing certainty with discomfort. And the mother-in-law felt it deeply. Every solution that worked, every connection that reopened, every crisis that eased became undeniable proof that her prejudice had been wrong. Worse than wrong, it had been costly. The husband too was changing. He began to understand that love without protection is not love at all. Watching his wife shoulder responsibility without bitterness forced him to confront his own passivity. He saw the emotional labor she had carried alone for years, the strength she had developed in isolation, and the grace she still chose despite everything. Outside the family, whispers began to circulate. People noticed the sudden turnaround. Questions were asked. Credit shifted. For the first time, her name was spoken with respect in spaces that had previously ignored her entirely. Not because she sought recognition, but because results demand acknowledgement. Yet even as power shifted, she remained intentional. She did not weaponize their dependence. She did not humiliate them in return. That restraint confused some and humbled others. Revenge would have been easy. Dignity required strength. Internally, she reflected on her journey. She remembered the younger version of herself who once hoped acceptance would come through patience. She honored that version, but she no longer lived there. This woman understood now that self-worth does not wait for permission. It declares itself. The family dynamics shifted permanently. Where she once sat quietly, she now stood confidently. Where she was once excluded, she was now essential. But essential did not mean obligated. Every contribution she made was a choice, not a duty. The mother-in-law struggled most with this reality. Power had moved away from her, and no amount of control could reclaim it. The hierarchy she once enforced had collapsed. Respect was no longer inherited, it was earned. And the hardest truth of all settled in slowly. The woman she had judged as too dark carried the light that saved them. By the time pride began to fracture, it did so quietly, the way old stone finally gives in after years of pressure. There was no dramatic collapse, no public confession, no sudden transformation. Instead, there was a slow unraveling of certainty, especially for the mother-in-law whose authority had once gone unquestioned. She now lived with an awareness she could not escape. Every restored contract, every stabilized account, every problem redirected toward resolution carried the same unspoken truth. None of this existed without the woman she had rejected. The family's recovery had a name and a face, and it was one she had once dismissed with cruelty masked as preference. The house felt different to her now. Rooms that once reflected her control now echoed with reminders of her dependence. She watched the woman move through shared spaces with calm assurance, never boastful, never resentful, yet unmistakably powerful. That composure unsettled her more than anger ever could have. For years, the mother-in-law had believed hierarchy protected order. She believed status was preserved by keeping others beneath it. But here was living proof that her hierarchy had nearly destroyed everything she valued. The system she trusted had failed. The woman she underestimated had not. Regret is a difficult thing for someone accustomed to control. It requires surrender, and surrender feels like weakness to those raised on dominance. Yet desperation has a way of rewriting beliefs. One evening, as the weight of reality pressed heavier than ever, she found herself alone with the truth she had avoided for years. The discrimination had not been accidental. It had been deliberate. It had been taught, reinforced, and justified. And now it stood exposed, stripped of all its excuses. Meanwhile, the woman at the center of this reckoning remained focused. She had drawn clear boundaries: professional, emotional, and personal. She offered solutions, not submission. Support, not self-erasure. Her involvement had conditions even if they were never spoken aloud. Respect was no longer something she hoped for. It was the minimum requirement for access. The husband, witnessing this shift, underwent his own quiet transformation. He began to understand that neutrality in the face of harm is a form of alignment. His wife's strength forced him to confront the ways he had benefited from her silence while failing to protect her dignity. Guilt followed, but so did growth. The family dynamic restructured itself around her influence. Decisions deferred to her judgment. Planning relied on her insight. The same people who once questioned her place now waited for her guidance. The irony was not lost on anyone, least of all her. And still she did not celebrate their dependence. She understood that real power does not need witnesses. It needs integrity. The mother-in-law eventually reached the edge of her pride, where denial could no longer survive. The crisis had humbled her, stripped away illusion, and left only truth behind. She realized that everything she feared losing, respect, legacy, stability, had been endangered not by the woman's presence, but by her own prejudice. Asking for help is one thing. Asking the right person after years of harm is another. When she finally acknowledged that she needed more than professional intervention, that she needed grace, it felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory. The moment was not dramatic. There were no grand gestures. Only an unspoken understanding that the power dynamic had permanently shifted. Help was no longer guaranteed. Forgiveness was not automatic. And redemption would require accountability. The woman saw all of this clearly. She recognized the weight of the moment, not as an opportunity for revenge but as a turning point. She knew that whatever came next would define the future, not just for the family but for herself. The final chapter did not begin with forgiveness. It began with truth standing fully exposed with nowhere left to hide. By now, the family's survival was no longer in question. The systems were stabilized, the damage contained, and the future redirected onto solid ground. What remained unresolved was not financial or professional. It was moral. The woman who had carried them through collapse now stood at the center of a reckoning that could not be outsourced or delayed. For the mother-in-law, this was the most difficult moment of all. The crisis had taken her authority, her certainty, and her illusion of superiority. What remained was an undeniable realization. The woman she had devalued was not only capable but exceptional. Not in spite of her skin but inseparable from it. The The darkness she once scorned held depth, intelligence, discipline, and grace she herself had never cultivated. Regret settled deeply, no longer abstract but personal. It reached into memories of dismissive looks, subtle exclusions, and deliberate silence. Each one now carried weight. Each one demanded accountability. But accountability does not guarantee forgiveness. The woman understood this better than anyone. She had lived long enough knowing that healing does not require reconciliation, and strength does not require approval. She reflected on her journey, not with anger but with clarity. She had entered this family hopeful. She had endured it patient. She had survived it silent. And she had risen independent. Everything she had done to save them was intentional, not reactive. She had proven her power without cruelty, her intelligence without arrogance, and her dignity without performance. She had shown them who she was, not by demanding recognition but by refusing to disappear. Now came the final decision. The family expected resolution in the form they were comfortable with: restored harmony, quiet forgiveness, a return to normal with adjusted behavior. But normal had never worked for her. Normal had required her to shrink, absorb harm, and remain grateful for conditional acceptance. She chose differently. She made it clear, through action rather than words, that her future would not be built inside systems that required her pain as payment for belonging. Her help had saved them, but it had not erased the past. Support did not mean submission. Strength did not mean sacrifice of self. The marriage too faced its truth. Growth had occurred, but growth does not undo years of imbalance overnight. She recognized the effort, acknowledged the change, but honored her own boundaries above all else. Love, she now understood, must protect dignity, or it becomes another form of harm. And so she stepped forward, not away in bitterness but onward in purpose. Her life expanded beyond the family's reach. Her work flourished independently. Her influence grew without needing validation from those who once rejected her. She reclaimed joy without apology, peace without permission, identity without compromise. The mother-in-law was left with the full weight of consequence, not punishment but reality. She had been saved by the very woman she tried to diminish, yet could not reclaim the authority she once abused. That loss became her lesson. What the family gained was stability. What the woman gained was sovereignty. She emerged from the story not as a victim who survived, but as a queen who chose herself. Her skin, once labeled too dark, now stood as a symbol of endurance, wisdom, and unshakable power. The truth had come out, and with it, clarity replaced illusion. This was not a story about revenge. It was a story about elevation. About a woman who refused to let discrimination define her limits. About a family forced to confront the cost of prejudice. About the quiet, unstoppable rise of a Black woman who never needed approval to prove her worth. And as the chapter closes, one truth remains undeniable. When a queen knows her value, she does not beg for respect. She becomes the standard.